The Tuskegee Airmen were an all-black fighting group serving during World War II. They faced major segregation and discrimination while fighting for their country. This is their story. The Tuskegee Airmen were in service from 1941 to 1949. They were the first ever African American fighters in the military. Before these African Americans stepped up, there was never a black pilot in the military. All the Tuskegee Airmen volunteered for service because all of the African Americans who got drafted were either placed in the Army or the Navy. Out of the 992 pilots trained at Tuskegee, 450 were successfully shipped overseas and 66 lost their lives in action. The rest of the 992 pilots in the Tuskegee Airmen, such as my interviewee, Calvin Moret, just faced intense training at the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama.
The training was concentrated. I won't call it tough. At 18 years of age, your body can take a lot. It really can. And you're in a sense in a prime. And if you think back about any war, it's young men who get on the front lines. It's the young men who do the fighting. The generals who are directing things away in the background. It's very seldom that you see them up on the front line. They're not waving their sword or their musket or something like that. Somebody.
But the most challenging battle the Tuskegee Airmen faced was the battle against segregation in their home country. They were being discriminated against by their fellow Americans that they couldn't fight or help America as effectively as the whites could. They did not find it difficult to fight for their country while being discriminated against by other Americans.
The fact that we were Americans precluded the fact that our skin color as being associated with black.
During their time serving in World War II, they were not permitted to use big types of fighter jets, so most of them, such as Calvin Moret, flew P-40s, small fighter jets. Training was another major battle to face while serving for the Tuskegee Airmen. They always wanted to avoid being washed out. But that was never their first belief. The first belief of the Tuskegee Airmen during training was fighting for their country. In the initial training the Tuskegee Airmen faced, they had to learn mathematics and how to spot enemies or Allied jets in half a second. At war, the Tuskegee Airmen did in fact fight on both theaters of World War II, the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Tuskegee Airmen were pioneers, opening up a bunch of segregation solutions to rise. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that African Americans can fly and maintain a sophisticated combat aircraft just as well as the whites. I interviewed Mr. Calvin Moret. He grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood and had lots of white friends during his school years, but he still faced the discrimination that every black citizen faced, such as certain water fountains he could drink out of and what bathrooms he could use.
Everywhere we went, there were signs as if you could read, and I could read when I was a little boy, to know that for white only sign was aimed at me. It wasn't aimed at whites. It was aimed at me. So that if I saw a sign over a drinking fountain in a public place, I couldn't go drink out of it. There would be possible repercussions.
Mr. Calvin Moret decided to enlist in the military right before he finished high school. All of his life he had a strong interest for planes, so he knew he wanted to be in the Air Force. Calvin Moret went through a full year of training and was going to be shipped to Europe to fight against Nazi Germany. But the war had ended 4 days before his squad arrived. Later, he went back to Tuskegee and was going to be deployed to the Pacific Theater, but the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered days before he arrived. At the time, Mr. Moret was very disappointed about not getting to fight, but now he feels a lot differently about that subject. 6 years after the Tuskegee Airmen finished their service, President Truman desegregates the U.S. military. Calvin Moret feels that they contributed greatly to that event. The Tuskegee Airmen today are bringing lots of attention as they recently got awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by the President of the United States.